Now, if you just joined us, I'd like to welcome you to this 90-minute CPA Australia webinar, Tax Policy in Australia, Current Issues and Focus Areas. This is presented by Eleanor Casapidis, Alexis Kokinos and Andrew Orme. It's supported also by Kimberly Ohayon and Debdi Jahan in the chat box there. Now, to start the session, I'd like to hand you over to Eleanor to start the session. Eleanor, I'll get you to go ahead and unmute yourself, and I'll pass control to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and it's great to see so many people from across Australia dialing in. Today's webinar is on tax policy in Australia, current issues and focus areas. And this is a webinar that we haven't done for a while, and we're very grateful for you expressing your interest in this topic. We're privileged to have two very special guests with us today, Andrew Orme, who's Deputy Chief Tax Counsel at the ATO, and Alexis Kokinos, who is the Chair of the CPA Australia Taxation Centre of Excellence, as well as an Executive Director at Pitcher Partners. So to start the session, I have prepared a polling question just to get a sense of your perspectives on policy. And the question is, how important is CPA Australia's tax policy and advocacy work to you as a member? So what we're hoping is that because you've dialed into this webinar, perhaps it's very important, or perhaps you're actually not aware of what it is that we do, in which case you'd select answer number E. So as that poll counts down, what I might do is just briefly introduce Andrew, who will be our next speaker. So Andrew, as I mentioned before, is the ATO's Deputy Chief Tax Counsel. He's responsible for public advice and guidance. Prior to taking up that role in May this year, Andrew held a number of positions within the ATO, including as Assistant Commissioner for Independent Review and Large Market Objections and as an Assistant Commissioner in the Tax Counsel Network. Before joining the ATO, Andrew worked as a Senior Associate at Clayton Utz and a Policy Analyst at Treasury. So what Andrew will be talking about and why we've invited him to this webinar is to provide the ATO's perspective. So what is his role in public advice and guidance, and how does that feed into tax policy in Australia? So with that, I will hand over to Andrew to go through his slides.
Just before you do that, we do have those, oh, sorry there, Andrew. We do have the poll results, if you see that there, Eleanor.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I have. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Eleanor and to the CPA more generally for the opportunity to speak today. It would be great to speak to you face-to-face, engage whether my talk is intriguing or provocative or putting you to sleep. But in these times we're in, the webinar format is certainly the next best thing. So my role at the ATO has a somewhat lengthy title of Deputy Chief Tax Counsel for Public Advice and Guidance. That means that I have overall responsibility for the ATO's public advice and guidance program. And hence that's the topic I'd like to focus on today. I'd like to give you some insight into why public advice and guidance is critical to the tax system, into how to work out, how we go about working out what advice to produce, a little bit about how our preparation of advice is organised internally, hopefully enough to be helpful to you in understanding the ATO, but not too much to bore you, so won't dwell too much on the ATO's internal organisation. But also very importantly, our engagement with the community and the benefits of consultation, including the involvement of organisations like CPA and some recent topical areas. So the tax system is designed around the principle of self-assessment, and the system relies overwhelmingly on the willing participation of millions. The ATO, through audit and other assurance activities, is only able to intervene in the minority of cases. The credibility of the system and the level of compliance depends on the public accepting that there is a level playing field and that their fellow citizens are doing the right thing. Within this context, public advice and guidance plays a key role for a few different reasons. I've put 3 on the slide, but I've actually, for those who are listening carefully, I'm going to give 4 reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, it gives people the information to get it right, whether that be tax professionals, businesses, or individuals. Advice that is accessible, timely, practical, and accurate is a key enabler for taxpayers to get it right. Secondly, advice has an important role in building trust and confidence in the system through encouraging consistency of approach by taxpayers and encouraging best practice approaches to tax compliance and discouraging engagement in illegitimate or questionable tax practices. Thirdly, public advice contributes to the efficiency in the system. The same problem does not need to be solved by advisors and tax officers time after time if the conclusions are shared in the public domain. And finally, an additional benefit of public advice and guidance is that the transparency that it provides as to the ATO's thinking contributes to the predictability, certainty, and hopefully trust in the system. It's somewhat ironic that I left transparency off the dot points in the slides, but it is definitely an important feature of what the ATO is trying to do in its public advice and guidance context. So one of the goals is really to provide advice effectively at the time it is needed on the most important issues. And the next thing I want to talk about is how we work out what advice to prioritise. There are always more questions in the tax system than we can engage with through public advice. We need to prioritise what is most important. And although I pride myself as a bit of a tax nerd and enjoy the thorny interpretive questions, unfortunately it is not simply the case that the most interesting and intricate tax interpretive questions are the ones that we should work on. We need to understand the areas of highest demand. And this involves considering things like the areas where we're getting the most private ruling applications, where calls are coming into the call centres, and things like that. We also listen to feedback through consultation forums and via professional associations like CPA in considering what is necessary. Additionally, we look ahead to predict what issues will likely emerge in the future. Much of my year this year has been focused on our tax response to COVID-19, both in terms of dealing with the issues that the tax issues that COVID-19 has given rise to, and also the stimulus measures in response. Some of the issues that we have dealt with emerged through recognising patterns from frequent calls to ATO call centres, others through suggestions from professional associations. The first COVID-19 related tax query I heard was raised by somebody in a professional association, I think in late February, or it might have been the first couple of days of March, which was around how would limitations on travel affect central management and control of a company. Initially, my reaction, first instinct was to think that the concern was overblown and not to know that the next few months would be spent predominantly on issues like that one and others dealing with the various impacts of COVID-19. It's not just listening to professional associations as well, but also ourselves looking ahead to see what issues would likely emerge next. And in the COVID-19 context, looking from the impacts of restrictions on movement and cancellation of events through to the flow and impacts around debt and business failure, to longer run issues around tax losses and other things. We also prioritise public advice and guidance according to ATO strategies. For instance, the work on understanding the tax gap has showed a significant contributor to the gap for individuals is the overclaiming of work-related expenses. So part of that strategy in terms of addressing that gap has been to invest in modernising guidance on work-related expense issues, which is an ongoing program of work. Increasingly, we're aware that the ATO advice offering is not just about telling people how we consider the law applies, but is also about shaping compliance behaviour. about promoting good tax governance, and about giving people an understanding of what behaviour is likely to attract our attention. The ATO's public advice offering covers a wide range of products for all different audiences. And the type of advice we provide will depend on the purpose we're seeking to achieve and the audience that we're producing that for. In some cases, the issue we're addressing may lend itself actually to a suite of different advice products aimed at different audiences or different aspects of an issue. I've listed on this slide some of the key forms of advice that we provide. You'll obviously be familiar with the flagship products that we produce, tax rulings and tax determinations that are of long standing. With occasional exceptions, these are binding products. Some people ask us if we're moving away from a focus on binding products, most definitely we're not. They still remain an important part of our advice offering. To the extent that other forms of advice and guidance seem to be growing, like web guidance and practical compliance guidelines, this reflects an appreciation of the different roles of these products rather than any desire to avoid binding advice. A focus area in recent years has been law companion rulings, initially called law companion guidelines. These are developed around the same time that new law is being enacted. A key reason for this product type is our value add can be greater if the advice is provided at the time that tax practitioners and taxpayers are implementing new legislative measures. Sometimes we've been able to produce draft advice even at the exposure draft stage of legislation, enabling the ATO's draft interpretation to inform consultation on the development of the legislation itself. Obviously, a function of the law companion ruling being about new law is that we don't have all the answers to all the practical issues. So there may also be a place for further advice down the track. A point of some discussion recently is whether the law companion ruling has been encroaching on the territory of the explanatory memorandum. I do see them as having quite distinct roles. Whilst I envisage that there'll be further work that we undertake with Treasury and likely consultation with professional bodies on the respective role of each product and the best process for advice on new law, I do think the law companion ruling has an important role to play that will continue. It isn't, though, necessarily the focus for each and every measure. It does depend on whether there are particular interpretive issues that need to be fleshed out through that sort of ruling advice. We see advice being not just about what the law means, but also about giving people the tools to feel confident about how they are positioned in the tax system. This has led to the other big development in public advice products in recent years, the introduction of practical compliance guidelines. Some PCGs identify safe harbour situations, but more typically they set out the ATO's position in relation to the use of compliance resources in particular contexts. In other words, whether we're likely to scrutinise the position adopted by a taxpayer. There is some similarity between the context of PCGs and what has previously been published in practice statements, although PCGs are written for external audiences rather than ATO staff. Like with interpretive products, we aspire to be producing them when they are needed on emerging issues. And it is notable that in some cases we have actually had PCGs as part of a suite of products with law companion rulings or tax rulings to deal with different aspects. PCGs have proven to be particularly well suited to topics where it's difficult to give firm technical advice because the precise answers are highly sensitive to individual facts. Perhaps for this reason, some of the notable PCGs have concerned transfer pricing, issues such as related party finance and offshore marketing hubs, and also in respect of inbound distributions and transfer pricing. These types of PCGs allow taxpayers to make choices influenced by their appetite for risk as to whether they wish to ensure that they are operating in a way the ATO is likely to see as low risk, or whether they are willing to take a position that is more likely to be closely scrutinised. I don't want to focus too much on taxpayer alerts today, but note that they are in one sense the flip side of PCGs, indicating where we are likely to have concerns about arrangements. Now, advice directed to individuals and small business website guidance rather than contained in one of our legal database products. We do recognise that for this community, ato.gov is sort of the go-to place for a lot of information. And a key goal here is to deliver information that is in a way that is accessible and not filled with text jargon that can be well understood. There's more a focus on what people need to do in the main cases rather than dealing with every single nuance and complexity. One of the dilemmas we have with guidance is how much detail to go into. The instinct is to try and cover off on every single issue and scenario. However, sometimes the more information, the greater the level of confusion. So there is a balance that does need to be struck. And we look at layering advice as well, so that people don't necessarily need to go, or a high-level page, they don't necessarily need to get into all the intricacies of an issue. Next, I want to talk a little bit about how we go about developing public advice and guidance within the ATO in a practical sense. And I don't want to get, I know you don't want to get into the internal machinations of the ATO to a great extent. However, I think it can be helpful for practitioners in engaging with the ATO to have a rough sort of mental model of how we work. We don't have a single area in the ATO that is solely responsible for producing public advice and guidance. Rather, the team I lead has a leadership and governance role to promote good public advice throughout the ATO. Most public advice that we produce about tax issues is sponsored by business line within the client engagement group of the ATO. So public groups and international, or private wealth, or small business, super and employer obligations, or individuals and intermediaries, one of those groups. There is some public advice, mainly on administration issues, that are produced by the ATO service delivery area. Typically, the driver for advice will be identified by the relevant staff responsible for managing risk within the relevant client engagement group. For example, an area looking at international risk within public groups and international may identify issues of concern within capitalisation. If they did that, they would develop a treatment strategy that would likely involve a number of strands. For example, engagement with key taxpayers, a particular focus on some compliance activities, warnings of high-risk behaviour, and public advice. And the public advice might have multiple components, such as advice on interpretive issues and practical compliance guidelines. The Tax Council network will usually take a key role in producing the public advice, generally to a greater extent in tax interpretive products like rulings, and lesser roles in more routine website advice, particularly if there's a lack of technical controversy. Although practical compliance guidelines and taxpayer alerts are not interpretive publications, they will involve Tax Council network staff. Occasionally, our critics complain that the greater emphasis on PCGs reflects how we wish the law was rather than how it is. But a key role of the Tax Council network team is to ensure that the legal basis for approaches in practical compliance guidelines and taxpayer alerts is sound. I also talk on this slide, or mention on this slide, PAG units. Within each of the client engagement group business lines, there are PAG units that have a role for coordinating advice and guidance. And my team sits within the Tax Council network, and we're called the PAG Centre, and we have an overall coordination role, and all high-risk public advice comes through to me for final sign-off. So I know that sounds like a little bit of a complex process. I think overall, the observation I'd make is that it is sort of a distributed system for producing public advice and guidance rather than being tightly controlled in one area. I do note that some other tax administrations take different approaches. I believe in New Zealand, the public advice and guidance, for example, is much more centred in their Office of the Chief Tax Counsel function. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is our approach to consultation. So for as long as I've been working in tax, consultation has been valued as an important part of developing advice and guidance. From an ATO perspective, consultation is valuable for a whole host of reasons. For one, despite our own egos, we don't always have all the answers ourselves. Often it is not simply a matter of getting a different view on a binary interpretive issue, this means A or it means B, but rather consultation can draw out that there are different ways of viewing the problem entirely, or flow-on consequences from a proposed interpretation that may not have been considered. Those in industry or advisors may also have a more comprehensive idea of the issues that really need to be addressed through advice and guidance, and this can provide really useful insight that we draw out through consultation. We have traditionally relied to a large extent on consultation through public drafts and submissions on those drafts. This is still an important avenue, although we have increased the amount of targeted consultation we undertake, which is invaluable in drawing out the issues early. There are really important roles for consultation forums as well in discussing technical issues, surfacing those issues that are of most concern to taxpayers and to advisors, and also to exploring the boundaries to whether there are issues that can be, I guess, resolved through ATO advice or to be taken up through, policy forums with Treasury. An important part of our approach to producing advice is on relevant matters, making sure that we obtain objective sort of viewpoints through external opinions, and in particular we engage with external expertise on some matters through the Public Advice and Guidance Panel, what we used to call the Rulings Panel, to test our views and sometimes seek advice from external counsel on issues as well. It is important on any matter, and it's something that I look at when I am approving advice, is to make sure that a range of perspectives have been considered and that, ensuring that people haven't fallen sort of foul of groupthink, for example, in developing a position. In terms of how we go about consultation, I think what I like to see is more emphasis on early and frequent consultation with stakeholders, less reliance on, the formal written submissions. We don't just want to throw one paper over the fence and another one back, but actually talking and working through issues, identifying and clarifying the issues that matter most. We're also aspiring to be clearer in terms of what we are working on and transparent about where we're at in producing advice through the Advice Under Development program, transparent ultimately in providing feedback on why we have settled on the views that we have, for example, through publishing compendia of comments when we finalised advice. Within the ATO, the Consultation Hub is responsible for coordinating consultation processes and arrangements with external stakeholders. I'll just quickly reflect on a few recent experiences, and it may be that more come out through questions that were asked about or that people might ask after my presentation's over. Some of the areas of focus recently, I mentioned earlier, we've been doing work around work-related expenses. To a large extent, this was motivated by realising the extent of the tax gap issue with work-related expenses. Much of the advice, the ATO has given a lot of advice on work-related expenses issues over many years, but a lot of that advice is dated. There's quite a lot that relate back to the 90s. And so we're undertaking a range of work to modernise that advice. The work-related expenses issue also, I guess, highlights the benefit of clear communication that probably beyond sort of, formal public advice, but just clear messaging around, we've been talking about the 3 golden rules of work-related expenses, for example, and just continuing to get those sort of basic messages out are an important part of the overall strategy. We've also, in the work-related expenses context, looked to move beyond, or not focus so much on the formal rulings, although we're doing some work there, but also producing new sort of products, for example, infographics aimed at particular industries to sort of highlight some of the key issues that come up. The next one mentioned is the draft ruling that we have out around fringe benefits tax and car parking. One of the issues dealt with in that ruling is, I don't want to get too much into the ruling because I'll sort of get lost in it, but there's an issue there around how to identify a commercial car parking station and whether something can be a commercial car parking station if it provides all-day parking, but it does so at a rate which discourages being used for that purpose. So largely, like supermarket car parks, the price is intended to encourage, 1 or 2 hour parking rather than all-day parking. The ATO's position had traditionally been that such car parks weren't commercial parking stations. After a decision a few years ago in the Qantas matter, there were views put to the ATO that that position couldn't be sustained in light of the AAT decision. This is something that the ATO, I guess, didn't sort of immediately act on. It wasn't initially sort of put as a top priority, and it sat on the back burner actually for a couple of years. Ultimately, though, when we started progressing the issue, it did become apparent that to us that the view did need to change in light of the Qantas decision. There was some consultation around that and some discussions with consultation forums, but the issue actually really sort of came to life and got some controversy after we issued a draft ruling on the topic. So an outcome of that was the ATO and Treasury participating with professional associations in some tripartite discussions to advance those issues. As I said earlier, much of my year this year has been working on public advice and guidance responding to various issues raised by COVID-19 and stimulus measures. One, I guess, aspect of the work this year is that things have been moving very quickly, and it has been necessary to produce actually advice in short timeframes for the community. Sometimes people have been satisfied with those timeframes. Sometimes they wish that we had done things more quickly. But certainly there has been, a focus on being more responsive. One thing I would say there is that sometimes in our desire to be more responsive, we've had to perhaps, or we haven't maybe undertaken as much consultation as would have been ideal in some times. But also I would say that we have been supported very much by the tax profession and by the professional associations in particular in undertaking some quick consultation where needed on some products. For example, just to talk quickly about stimulus measures, with JobKeeper, we've produced a PCG on some schemes issues, and we produced a law companion ruling on the turnover test, both of which we engaged in some really quick, sharp, targeted consultation because we knew that the timeframes for usual consultation weren't really sort of feasible. The demand to get advice that quickly was overwhelming, but the quick consultation that we undertook on both of those things, we benefited immeasurably from the input from the participants in that consultation. So it's been a really good experience, and certainly when we hopefully return to more normal times, one of my goals is to reflect on the benefits of what we've done well, or where we've had some challenges through this year, and what we can harness or what we can learn from that to do better in the future. All right, so oh no, I'm skipping onto Alexis's slides. That's sort of getting ahead of things. Look, I guess by way of final comments, I just want to reiterate that we really value the role of professional associations and the contribution that members of professional associations make in the consultation process. The tax system is not one that any of us sort of own. The tax system is a sort of national asset that we all contribute to the effective operation of, and the public advice and guidance program is an important part of that system. The interaction that we have with consultation forums and their external members is very important to what we do, and we are contributing, in working together, we are contributing to something that I think is really valuable. So look, that's probably all I had to say. I think at this point I'm handing back to Eleanor.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a fantastic summary, I think, of what the public advice and guidance area at the ATO does. I've just popped a message in the chat box. If you do have questions for Andrew or things that you'd like a bit of clarity on, by all means, send them through. What we have next is a quick polling question before we lead on to Alexis's slides. So we would like to know what your main channel is to get involved in tax policy. So directly with government, through the media, through CPA Australia discussion groups, responding to articles in CPA Australia Update or Tax News, or emailing us directly, or perhaps you don't get involved but you are interested in policy nevertheless. So while that polling question runs, I just wanted to recognise Andrew's acknowledgement of the role of professional associations. So in my role here as Tax Policy Advisor, I sit on multiple committees, but also am the conduit between members and the various regulators and policy setters in Australia or across Australia. So in that sense, as your representative, members are always welcome to contact us at our policy and advocacy email address, or you have my details. You can look me up and contact me directly if there are issues that are concerning you or that you want to get involved. We also have our Tax News weekly newsletter, and I tend to include a lot of the policy activities in there for members to consider and to get in touch with us if they want to discuss. But most importantly, we also have a Taxation Centre of Excellence, which is why I have invited Alexis today to come and speak with us. So Alexis is a partner in the Tax Consulting Division at Pitcher Partners with over 25 years experience providing tax advice to a large number of corporate clients. He leads the Pitcher Partners National Association's Tax Technical Division and is heavily involved in consultations with the ATO and Federal Treasury. He has also been a member of the Board of Tax Advisory Panel and been included in reviews such as Division 7A, collective investment vehicle regimes, and all sorts of very clever things. So Alexis joined Pitcher Partners in 2010, having been a partner at a Big Four accounting practice previously. So I'd like to welcome Alexis to our webinar and hand over the slides.
Great. Thank you very much, Eleanor. I'll just get my slides on. So thank you, Eleanor, for the introduction and for the opportunity to present and talk today. First, I wanted to thank Andrew for his presentation. It's fantastic getting the perspective of the ATO and understanding exactly what happens in the background around consultation. And we've been working with Andrew quite closely on a number of measures that I'll talk through today. And what I'd like to do as a part of my talk is talk about why policy and advocacy is important, why we do get involved with that. I'd like to talk about our approach, because the approach to consultation can be different depending on who you are and how you're advocating for certain changes. So I'd like to talk about generally how we approach our consultation. I'd like to talk about the Centre of Excellence, which I think is a fantastic resource here at the CPA, and what we do around representing the members and how you might be able to get involved, and also talk about the forums that are represented by the CPAs, or where we get involved with ATO and Treasury consultation. Lastly, I wouldn't mind talking about some recent experiences. Andrew mentioned a number of those, and I might talk about a few of those and talk about our experience and how how the process has gone from our perspective as well. So before I commence, it's probably worth me just briefly giving a bit of background about myself. Eleanor's given most of the background, but in terms of my background, my client base is very similar to most CPA members. I predominantly work in the middle market, so my client base is in the middle market, some small, some large, but I would say that the middle market, from my perspective, has probably the highest degree of requirement for compliance. We not only have to comply with all of the private taxation rules, but also a lot of the rules that are developed for the big end of town where they don't have carve-outs. So I think one of our key concerns always in consultation is that every time we add a tax rule to the system, there's something additional for us to comply with. And as we know, our client base aren't always the ones that can pay lots of fees to look at rules. So compliance is obviously something very top of mind when we're looking at rules. So I think one area one trap you can fall into having that background is that you can simply try to oppose any new changes that are coming through, and that is certainly a strategy many people do put forward in consultation, in terms of they will look to reject any changes, but rarely does that work, and it needs to go back to the fundamentals in terms of why changes are being made, and understanding that, and then how we can get involved. Now, obviously, there's changes that are made for various reasons, but in a lot of the cases, a lot of the changes proposed are due to an integrity risk in the system, or there'll be public policy reasons why those changes need to be made. And so, understanding that as a first step is always important in terms of knowing that those changes are very likely to go through, irrespective of what consultation processes we go through. So if we're starting on that premise and understanding the policy of the provisions, what we like to do is then ensure that provisions are appropriately targeted, that they are providing appropriate outcomes, they can be implemented by our members at the CPA, and that the ATO won't have difficulty administering those provisions as well, that we won't get into a lot of debates and disputes with the ATO when those measures are finally implemented. So going through that type of system, we often find that we could still oppose the measures, or we could provide a number of suggestions in terms of how those measures can be implemented in a manner that is more effective and easier to implement for our. So, in my view, consultation really does require one to commence with the policy of the provisions, and understanding policy sometimes sets you back in terms of it also determines who we're going to deal with as a part of our consultation process. I'm going to just go through an example just to demonstrate and to explain sort of where we came from on one aspect. And there's a recent case in the federal court, which is Greensill, which was dealing with some capital gains and flowing through those to non-residents. And it raised an issue as to whether, for example, a broader issue, whether foreign-sourced capital gains should flow through a discretionary trust to non-residents. And if you took the issue from a fairness perspective, you say, okay, if it's foreign-sourced income flowing through to foreign beneficiaries, there shouldn't be any Australian tax. You'd say if they invested directly, why should we be paying tax? But then when you look at it more closely and you try to put a policy hat on top of that and understand where the ATO may come from, Within the CGT provisions, there's a specific carve-out if you're a fixed trust. So if you've got an interest in the underlying asset, there is effectively an exclusion for that, and that makes sense. It's like you would invest into it directly. But with a discretionary trust and discretionary powers, there is no exception in the provisions. And so if you examine it from a policy perspective, you'd say there probably isn't an underlying policy that should allow for those to flow through tax-free to non-residents, and that the ATO may be hamstrung in terms of trying to take a view on those provisions that provided such an exception. And understanding that policy setting would also then ensure that when we're consulting on this issue, yes, we can raise these issues with the ATO, but this is an issue that's more likely to be one that we need to take up with the government and Treasury if we're looking for policy change. And then if we are to raise that, and the CPA has a lot of issues that we're trying to advocate for our members, we'd have to understand the importance of the issue and how important it is to fix that issue, which would take into account compliance issues for our members, as well as what benefits we believe addressing this issue could have for the public. We would raise issues such as benefits to the economy and other things as well as a part of that process. So just as a basic example, as the Centre of Excellence, when we are looking at issues, we are definitely coming from it from a policy perspective to make sure that we are targeting the issues in the correct manner and going through the right channels when we are advocating for changes or to get our views put forward. Now, advocacy doesn't always just look at new legislation. So our role does look at a lot of the current measures, and what we do look at, and I will discuss a bit more in the when we talk about the Centre of Excellence, we do look at current measures and where we think those measures are providing, for example, inequitable outcomes or inefficiencies in the system. And once we identify those, and we think they're also broadly impacting our member base, those are issues that we do like to take to either ATO and Treasury, depending on whether interpretive decisions or whether legislative changes may be required to correct those. On many occasions, they do just require interpretive clarification, and those are issues that we do bring to the ATO's attention. We try to bring those early as well so that we can get clarity, because obviously providing an ATO view can be quite beneficial in making sure our members can comply with what the ATO's views are on certain matters. On managing tax risk and governance, so obviously tax risk and governance is a very important issue for CPA members, and it is something the ATO is significantly focusing on at the moment. However, what I would like to say is that in terms of tax risks, what we believe is critical is for any practice, there is obviously a lot of tax risk, but understanding material tax risk and identifying those tax risks for your practice is what we would say is absolutely essential. And so from our perspective, we believe it is critical to identify those, discuss those with the ATO and make sure that appropriate guidance is provided to our members so that we can appropriately manage those material tax risks that are currently in the environment. Just finally, what I'd like to say around the importance of advocacy is that the CPA is one of the most significant intermediaries in the tax system. We represent a large number of tax agents, we represent a large number of taxpayers. So it is absolutely critical that we are feeding our experiences back into the system so that it can pick up our experiences and that the system can adapt for what we're going through. Our role, it is quite critical that we do play a role in setting policy as well as debating policy and changes. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So as Eleanor mentioned earlier, the CPAs have a Centre of Excellence, and to be honest, the CPAs have always had a Centre of Excellence. It's been around for a long time, but through the work Eleanor's been doing over the last 12 months, we've had a large revamp of our Centre of Excellence. And we're really refocusing what our team does at the Centre of Excellence, our membership and what our priorities are. And it's just useful to probably outline exactly what we are doing in the background and how you may get involved in this. So the team consists of about 14 members which is, as Eleanor pointed out, was senior tax professionals. Most people on the Centre of Excellence have over 20 years tax experience, represented by Big Four, mid-tier, small practices, sole practitioners. So we have a really broad range of membership on the Centre of Excellence, and we try to get as many different views on that panel. We also have members that are specialists in certain areas, GST, R&D, for example, where we can bring to account those exact specific issues that are being faced in those sectors as well. We also, some of us are in some larger practices, so we can bring in specialists from our practices into those debates too, in terms of when we're looking at issues. As a group, we meet quarterly. We were having face-to-face pre-COVID. I think we had our first Zoom meeting and our last meeting, which went quite well as well. But we are meeting quarterly to discuss issues, and when there are things that are require our input, we meet on an ad hoc basis in terms of where there's a specific need. So one of the main aims of the Centre of Excellence is to try and provide formal guidance to the ATO and Treasury on tax policy issues and help and to assist in identifying key issues in relation to the tax system. And we do this as a group by going through a number of points, which I'm just going to touch on very, very briefly, just to give an idea of what we are doing. So during our quarterly meetings, we do, as a priority, discuss what we see as current and emerging tax issues relevant to the profession. And some of these issues are raised by us that we see in our practice. Others are raised by members that have been raised as issues, and we discuss those issues. They range from technical issues to compliance issues, so there's a whole broad range of issues that are raised, and we discuss those. We understand whether there is a real technical issue that needs to be raised, and to the extent we see them as important, we also bring those forward to the HO or Treasury, depending on the type of issue. We also discuss whether there's matters that require comments from us in a technical or technical manner from either ATO or Treasury, and this involves usually submissions being made on a formal or informal basis. And as a group, we discuss those, and we also contribute to putting those together too. And we share those, I understand, through various CPA means on newsletters, etc., in terms of the output that we do. The Centre of Excellence also has a proactive approach to thought leadership. So it is one of our agenda items. Each period we look at ways in which we can be proactive in contributing to the system. So we have a number of topics that we're going through, and we're going to be looking to do thought leadership pieces that are put out. So the current topics that we're working through include transfer pricing, global transfer pricing review, where we can interact with our other CPA bodies on an international basis. We're looking at a review of the GST system, a review of CGT provisions, small business concessions, and trust provisions. So there's a number of things where we're trying to be proactive in terms of putting forward thought leadership on how we can better the system around those various aspects. We're also very cognizant of the many issues our profession is facing on automation, effects of globalisation and e-business, and we have that as a standing agenda item as well, to discuss the ongoing role of CPA members and how we can assist our members in that intermediary role in helping their clients and taxpayers. And finally, the Centre of Excellence does have an input into all the products that the CPA does put out to members from a tax perspective, which includes appropriate training products and other information that is otherwise shared. For example, the large focus of our time during the last number of meetings has been the COVID-19 landing page the CPA has, and a lot of the material that's been shared in relation to the stimulus measures with the members. So we have a very extensive role. A lot of it is in the background. We spend a lot of time doing a lot of those items in the background, so it's worthwhile just sharing that with you. In addition to that, we do spend a lot of time representing the CPA profession, and that's through consultation with Treasury and ATO. There's also consultation with the Board of Tax, Inspector General and other departments like the Tax Agents Board as well, where we do engage. I'd say the majority of my time, and I would have thought our time, would be predominantly with ATO, and we spend a lot of time with Treasury on new measures when they require that to be made. So we are very active in many of the consultation forums, and that includes ATO forums. One of the main forums is the NTLG, National Tax Liaison Group, where we talk about big policy issues. Generally, we don't really get into the nitty-gritty on technical issues, which are dealt with in other subgroups and subcommittees. And on that, the CPAs are represented on a number of the ATO forums. That includes the Tax Practitioners Stewardess Group, the GC Working Group, Tax Practitioners Board, Consolidated Forum, ATO Fringe Benefits Working Group, etc. There's a lot of groups that deal with a lot of the technical matters or the compliance matters that are raised from members and from various firms that we deal with with the ATO on a very specific basis. And our consultation, as I mentioned, isn't limited to ATO forums. We represent our members on the Board of Taxation reviews and a lot of the Treasury reviews, especially around draft legislation or pre-draft legislation in terms of where we're just trying to get policy right. Now, our group doesn't always consult on every single matter. There are measures that aren't that are probably the ones that we don't need to get involved in. So we do pick and choose the ones that are very important to our members and very important to us as tax consultants as well. As I mentioned, the CPAs is one of the largest accounting bodies and one of the most significant intermediaries for the tax system. So it really is critically important for the CPAs to feed through our experiences to the ATO so that they can understand exactly what the issues are that we're facing. ATO do see issues, I'm sure, but they probably see them in a lag effect. They get them probably later than what we see them. We see them probably as issues come up. And there are issues that cause us concern, but there's also issues where we can see integrity risks, where we would like to ensure that the ATO can provide their commentary around those issues to earlier rather than later, which can cause issues for members if they are identified at a later stage. Our approach is very balanced, as I've gone through. We do try to make sure our approach is balanced. We are taking into account policy as we go through things, and I think that approach has created a really strong mutual trust and respect between us, ATO and Treasury through this process, which is quite advantageous for when we are consulting with ATO and Treasury. They know exactly where we're coming from, and it is easier to work with those departments when we're starting on that basis. So that's a lot of theory I know in the background and what we do, but it's probably worthwhile spending a little bit of time just talking through some practical examples of what we've been going through for the last 6 months. And a lot of my time, as Andrew pointed out, has been around stimulus measures, where I've spent a great degree of time on those. From my perspective, it's been a fantastic experience working with ATO and Treasury very, very closely around the stimulus measures. What we've been doing as a part of the NTLG group has been raising issues with ATO and Treasury as and when they've come up. And we've raised really important issues, especially around JobKeeper. We've been raising a number of interpretive issues. The ATO have been fantastic in taking those on board and providing guidance and updating their guidance constantly on those important issues. We have been mindful to try to prioritise the important issues. So we have flagged which ones have had priority to assist the ATO in terms of their resources, because they're obviously limited in their resources in addressing every single issue. As an example, on JobKeeper, one of the items we did identify very early was how service entities interacted with JobKeeper. Now, this was something the CPAs picked up early through a lot of member queries that we'd received, as well as issues that we'd faced as a part of the Centre of Excellence. We took an approach where we consulted both with Treasury and ATO on this. Again, we understood that the rules had already been released. It was very difficult to get wholesale change on this, and Treasury were concerned about how broad they could go with rules, and we understood that context very early. So we did work with Treasury in trying to help them frame a confined set of provisions from a Treasury perspective, which wouldn't have dealt with all of the cases. But in the background, we also worked very closely with the ATO in respect of a PCG that was released, and that provided some practical guidelines in terms of service entities reducing their fees, where the ATO outlined where that wouldn't result in a high integrity risk if there were certain circumstances where you did reduce fees to get and then became entitled to JobKeeper. So the two-pronged approach enabled us to get a lot of guidance very, very quickly from both parties that we thought would be reasonable and would assist our members. On Division 7A, again, what we've been working on is around some guidance from, again, both Treasury and ATO on this. First of all, we were cognizant that there would be no announcements on Division 7A, and we're approaching 30 June, and the new measures were supposed to start 1 July. So again, we're proactive in going to the Minister's office on these measures to ask for an indefinite carry forward of those provisions for no start date until a later time. So it could provide more certainty to the marketplace about where we sit on Division 7A matters. And it was good to see that the Assistant Treasurer did come out with that announcement pre-30 June, which is a direct result of those submissions that we made in the background. With the ATO, we also strongly advocated for a discretion to be provided around taxpayers not being able to make minimum loan repayments due to COVID-19. And again, it was great to see the ATO came out with their 109RD short form application process to where you can go through with the ATO how you can get that discretion if you were unable to make minimum loan repayments in time by 30 June. So again, ATO were very responsive on that and consulted with us based on the suggestions that we had made in the background. So again, great experience on that. We also are dealing with matters in the long term. For example, in the background OECD, there is a Pillar 1 and 2 review on an OECD perspective, which Australia is very much involved with, and the CPAs are on that consultation with Treasury in the background. Now that's obviously going to go for 12 months, 2 years, who knows how long that will be, but we have had probably 5 meetings already with Treasury. And again, that enables us at the early stage to get involved and put forward our members' views to ensure that when we do get measures that they're appropriately dealt with. And one of the key issues we've been highlighting is carve-outs for smaller taxpayers around these, because these are very, very complex transfer pricing rules, and we're trying to ensure that they are targeted appropriately. On R&D, we made a very extensive submission earlier this year to the Senate Economics Committee around the new R&D measures. On this one, it's interesting, we did take an approach where we did not agree with the provisions. So we did point out that we do not support the R&D measures. We thought they were a backwards step and weren't in line with what's happening in the OECD. So we went through a very detailed analysis on that, and we again drew on a number of R&D experts through the COE to provide input into those. And look, the report hasn't been handed down by the Senate Economics Committee yet, so we'll see how successful we are around our submissions on that. Finally, tax time 2020. There's been quite a lot that's been happening around tax time, and it's mainly been around highlighting issues to the ATO and getting support from the ATO around COVID. And this has ranged from a lot of issues that have been discussed with ATO. All the extension of time in terms of lodgement of tax returns has come through a lot of the work we've been doing in the background, which has been multiple consultations with the ATO to try and get extensions of time for lodgements of tax returns, for extensions for payments, for PAYG refunds that we have worked with to get guidance on that. I think at one stage Eleanor was daily going through consultation on some of those measures to get advice and guidance on that. We've been going through difficulties around pre-filling that's going to come up around trying to lodge tax returns early and informing taxpayers around a number of things on concessions such as, working from home, shortcuts, Division 7A relief, etc. Throughout this process, again, we've been advocating for our members to try and get as much support around your lodgement processes and what you can do for your clients, because we understand it's a very difficult time. So we've been very active around that in the background with the ATO, and the ATO have been, again, fantastic in terms of their consultation around all of those measures. I think I'm probably running close to time, so I'm probably going to cut there. Again, or just as a summary, just again wanted to highlight how important the consultation role is, we believe, for CPA and for their members, how important it is to be involved, and again, some of the fantastic outcomes that we can achieve by being involved, not only for our members, but for the tax system in general. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Alexis. I will go to the next slide, which is the polling question, and introduce that. So what is one tax policy activity you'd like to see more of from CPA Australia? Some of them, as you can see, are more about communicating to you. Some of them are actually about communicating with the broader community or with government departments. So really interested to know what you think. Both Alexis and Andrew's presentations, I think, gave an indication of the breadth and the depth of the tax space. And a lot of the conversation, while related to income tax, also recognising that there's indirect taxes, there's state taxes, there's international tax issues. And being across this on behalf of the profession and as the administrator, the ATO needs to be across all of this, is a mammoth task. And I would like to give recognition to both all the profession as well as everyone in the ATO. The past few months, the amount of activity and work that has been undertaken has been absolutely phenomenal. So I've watched public servants, working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, and similarly people in the profession, not only helping clients, but also themselves understanding the law, providing feedback. Alexis and his team did an incredible job just going through all of the legislation and the rules and the guidance and making sure that it all made sense. And that joint responsibility also fed into Treasury processes, and Treasury was actually quite accessible as well. And, changes were being made in 24 hours, feedback was being given in a really timely manner, and it was really interesting to see how everything that we normally do, it was all in place and ready to go, but these last months, COVID-19 just put it on steroids. It just got put on fast forward, and it still worked. And so I just wanted to recognise the efforts and commitment of everybody in that space. From my perspective, I also saw a lot of members contacting me directly. Their questions, their criticisms in some respects were invaluable because it helped guide how we prioritise. So Alexis talked about how to prioritise things, as did Andrew. So it was about how we could keep touch with the pulse of the community, the pulse of the profession, and make sure that as intermediaries, we were able to represent everybody, the clients and the businesses. So I think that was a really amazing joining of forces, for want of a better term, and nice to see that webinars are something that you want to see more of. So you may hear from all of us again sometime soon. So with that, I will just put it as an open forum. We've asked for a few questions and some have come through. I was talking about COVID and just how we've worked together. Andrew, I was interested in how the ATO experience has been and whether there are any things that have happened, like in terms of responsiveness or working together or time frames and decision making, that you think you can take forward into business as usual.
That's a great question, Eleanor. And look, just before I answer that, I guess in terms of adding to the comments you made before about everybody working together, whether it be those participating in consultation or those just helping, their own clients, I've just seen the most immense effort being put in by so many people over the last few months, and it's just amazing to consider how all that's been achieved as well with all of our normal workplaces disrupted. And I just think it's truly extraordinary. So that's not really an answer to your question, but just sort of an observation about how that's gone. Look, in terms of the future, I mean, certainly, I guess we have been criticised from time to time that, producing public advice and guidance can be a very slow process. And so you know, we're often quite deliberate and considered because often it's because, I mean, there might be sort of a key issue, but sometimes the time required actually results, or is actually a function of all the sort of tentacles that hang off that issue. And so one has to be careful about what's done because you need to understand all the sort of flow-on ramifications. And so that's I mean, just one of a number of reasons why some pieces of work take a long time. I think our experience this year has just been to show that where the pressure's on and where advice is really needed quickly, you know, if the ATO and the profession work collaboratively together, we can actually provide advice even on maybe not the whole issue, maybe it's just a subset of the issue or a component to help people really quite quickly. And I do want to look at bringing some of that experience into, you know, our regular work. And I would also say, I mean, I just sort of reiterate some of the things Alexa said about the profession often being the first to see the issues and to surface those issues with the ATO, and that has really been a lot of what we've managed to achieve is by that sort of early intelligence of emerging concerns being brought to us, and then, you know, discussions and consultation, and you know, if people perceive that we're not taking things that are important seriously, sort of giving us the hassle and the prompt just to make sure that we're inspired into action. And so I think the profession's done really, really well in working with the ATO there. And I do want to see what elements of it we can take forward. Not everything needs to be done urgently, but there is, I think, quite a bit we can learn from the experience we've had.
And that's a really good point, Andrew, about not everything needs to be done urgently. So, Alexis, you've done a lot of consultation. You've sat on various committees and boards. How do you think it should be balanced? So, rushing things can actually lead to unintended consequences. So how do you see a good consultation or policy discussion evolving?
Yeah, and that question may depend on exactly what is being consulted on as well. And in the process, and how quickly we need to deal with certain items. But I think, as pointed out, and what Andrew had pointed out earlier, getting involved, getting practitioners involved early is, to me, the key. And Andrew mentioned that they are having targeted consultation early, and we have had some recent experiences where we're doing that with the ATO on a number of measures before they're going out, where we can consult early with the ATO because their initial views may not pick up all of the practical consequences that may come out if that became a public view. And I think it has two benefits in doing that targeted consultation. The first is obviously you could disrupt a lot of people by coming out publicly with something that hasn't thought through all the ramifications as part of that process. So it can help to keep away some of the noise for a lot of our members who are just trying to comply with the actual laws. And secondly, provides a lot of guidance to the ATO in terms of what the issues they may have missed on and can reflect on, so we can get to a more agreeable position. So when something does come out, that it's probably less likely to have some backlash or issues being raised. Now that's where you have the benefit of time, and not all the cases we have the benefit of time. And so we understand that some measures do need to go through very quickly, and we can spend a lot of time consulting, but we understand that on occasions there's going to be little chance of getting through changes or where submission points will be raised. So in those cases we do then need to highlight big P issues or the big policy issues where there's deal breakers, and make sure that we are identifying those real critical issues where that's the case. So again, it does really depend on the type of consultation.
And I think that in that sense, you tailor the consultation to suit the issue, and policy is very much upfront. While it's informed by a reaction quite often or some sort of economic imperative, it often is quite far-sighted and needs to be thought through. One of our participants did make a comment, though, that there has been an overload of policy changes, and I've heard anecdotally that, you know, tax law is by far has the most pages that go through Parliament in any given year, and it's constantly changing. And I would make the observation as well that the government looks to the ATO to not just deliver tax, but also transfer system initiatives and a broad range of other pieces of systems changes. So when we're dealing with so much, is there an opportunity to manage that, do you think, Alexis? I know that the ATO is the administrator, so I will hand to you, Andrew, in a moment, but Alexis, as sort of someone who sits in the environment, you're dealing with the impacts of the law that gets passed, but you're also looking at what's coming through. Do you think we can do things differently?
So that's an interesting and a hard question to answer. So I'll give two examples on this, on legislative change, where we thought that the provisions weren't needed, and we made some strong submissions on those. And one was the circular trust distribution rules that were amended, and another was the vacant land tax measures that were introduced as well. On both occasions, we said that the law worked appropriately. On circular trust, if you have a circular distribution, there's some cases that would suggest there's no present entitlement, so they get the same outcome just using normal case law. And we made very strong submissions around that, saying that they were introducing law for no reason. And on vacant land measures, we were saying the same thing in terms of if you don't have the nexus there, you shouldn't be getting the deduction. So obviously what's happening in the background, though, is that there may be a small population of taxpayers that are taking different views, and this provides more clarity to the law rather than anything else. So on many occasions, some of these large changes that we have to go through, unfortunately, are to provide clarity of what's already happening rather than changing what's happening. And in those cases, for members, it's a bit hard to understand whether these are law changes or not, and getting that information is quite important. Yeah, so I feel for, in terms of all the legislative changes going through, and some of it, you know, we advocate for carve-outs as well. Like the foreign hybrid, the hybrid mismatch rules is one key example, which is really complex legislation, no carve-outs for SMEs, and really difficult stuff to go through. Now, the CPAs in the background on that have been very successful in terms of one of the main provisions that our client base or our membership would have were what we call deducting hybrid provisions, where you have a foreign rental property and you could have $100 deductions and you're in these provisions. And we were successful in getting amendments through just recently that carved out individuals generally from those provisions. Now, that's in the background that a lot of people won't be aware of, and that took about 6 months to work through that with ATO and Treasury. And again, that probably as a part of the CPAs, it would be good if we also share that information too, to make sure that all the members are aware of some of those types of changes too. But in the background, we are trying to assist in reducing as much of the legislative changes that are unnecessary for our client base. But it is very difficult when Treasury or ATO see an integrity risk that they need to address.
Thanks, Alexis. And I think it acknowledges the fact that it's not always visible, the impact of good policy and good advocacy and good consultation, and it's actually what doesn't happen that's actually the benefit. I think in relation to the policy, the wave of policy changes that do come through, or the law changes, Andrew, you know, there's a lot of dependence on the ATO to help people understand those changes. So you mentioned the LCRs and other sort of guidance that gets issued. How do you manage such a high volume of change all the time? So not only are you getting issues escalated from existing legislation, but you're also having to inform the community and agents about what's coming through. How do you balance all of that? How does that work?
Goodness, maybe I should get you to suggest something for balancing that. It certainly does seem this year has been quite a challenge. Just to reflect on, I mean, I saw. So I think I'm delaying answering the question because I actually don't know. But just to, I guess part of what Alexis was talking about was around the volume of changes and how do you balance just from a policy point of view. I mean, do we have too much? Do we not have enough? I think this is not really my area at the moment, but I think this is the constant, I don't really have the solution, but this is the constant wrestle, I guess, as to, we can probably all think about issues in the system where we think, oh, it would be nice if there was just a bit of a tweak or a bit of a change, everything would work more smoothly. There's a constant balance, I think, in tax policy between, keeping the system stable, but sometimes imperfect, and trying to address every issue. And to some extent, even, I saw a comment come through about, simplification and reduction in law, and that's a great aspiration, but sometimes even the measures that are intended to simplify actually end up adding to complexity as well. So there are really thorny problems there.
Tax is never simple, even though
every new measure has, an implementation team that's looking at how to implement that within the ATO in terms of the advice that's required and other steps for that implementation. So it's just about ensuring that that burden is spread and that we are thinking about what is needed for each measure. And as I said earlier, law companion rulings, we don't do them automatically. It really depends on the issue and whether that sort of advice is needed in the context of that particular issue. Sometimes there are measures that sort of simply speak for themselves, and it's really a matter of just bringing appropriate attention to the issue on ato.gov, and not that much more needs to be said, whereas sometimes there are, the Staples legislation, for example, some quite complicated issues that we've been dealing with through a draft LCR that will hopefully be finalised before too long, that really go beyond, what we could deal with in website guidance.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I guess when we're looking at guidance, and you did mention layering, Andrew, so there are different tranches, I guess, of the different kinds of advice. Very often tax agents and advisors are so busy just keeping up with the changes, they're just looking for you to provide whatever product is most appropriate for them that addresses their issues. In your view, as intermediaries in the system and as being very close and connected to taxpayers, do you have a view about how much individual agents, individual tax professionals should pay attention to policy? What do you value about hearing in terms of their experiences and their views? How important is that to you as part of your public advice and guidance role?
Look, I think that sometimes within the ATO we think we understand what the issues that people have are, and sometimes we get that right, but sometimes we don't always appreciate all the variations and all the sort of complexity of the issues, and certainly getting the feedback from agents is really sort of influential on us. I mean, I think to me, I have looked at a range of comments, for example, made on some of the guidance we've produced on the JobKeeper system, and some of that landed well, some of it people had more trouble with, but I did read some of our critics on that, and even though at times some of that criticism was a bit hard to take in some ways, it really, when you understand the problems that people have and can see even the passion or the intensity of why it's a real problem, it does flow into really understanding the issues better and understanding how to make improvements. And so some of that came from not sort of I mean, obviously people like Alexis made a huge contribution through raising issues that are sometimes the refined technical issues, but actually sort of seeing some of the sort of more day-to-day response from tax agents saying, what on earth are they doing here, sort of thing, or what on earth does this mean, was really influential in us looking to make certain improvements.
That's really good to hear, and I think it's so good to know that that input is actually having an effect, and that you do consider it, because sometimes people may not be sure about where all of that goes and how it's responded to. So Alexis, you're a tax professional, you've been in the profession for quite some time, and you have actually made the effort to make time for policy. Why is that, and how did you manage to pull it off with your role?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm probably fortunate that I sit in a role that is 50% dedicated to being involved in consultation and new legislative changes, but that's mainly due. I mean, we value being able to input into new measures and what we do. So we obviously spend a lot of time dedicated to the CPA. And assisting in terms of our policy advocacy, and the main reason for that is, I mean, there's multiple reasons for it, but as a starting point, I mean, I can only imagine what the system would be like if we don't get involved with a lot of these changes. So a lot of these changes would go through as they were without any advocacy, and the compliance issues that would be faced by members would be astronomical. And so it gives us a fantastic opportunity to ensure that our practical issues are put forward, that we can help contribute to bettering the system. And at the end of the day, the tax system is there for all of us as well. So we want to make sure that there's integrity in the system, appropriate integrity, that balances all of the things such as compliance, policy, etc. We've had great experiences in consultation. We've had experiences where we get nowhere on items, but at the end of the day, a number of the significant changes that have happened for members and for ourselves have come through the consultation process. So from our perspective, it is definitely worthwhile being involved in the process.
Great words of advice. And so with that, I will draw the webinar to a close. I'd like to say a huge thank you to both Andrew and Alexis for being our guests today. It's been a privilege to have you here, and hopefully all of our participants have got something out of the presentation. I'd also like to say thank you to Deepti, Kimberly and Michael for being in the background and making sure things have gone smoothly. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, and hand back to Michael to finish it off and direct you to the feedback form.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Eleanor. Thanks, everyone, for being a part of today's presentation and participating in the polls, and also popping through your questions and comments into the chat box. It's exactly the way we like these webinars to unfold. I'd like to thank all the presenters and moderators for today. It was great to have you here. It was fantastic to get your thoughts on today's topic. Now, just to let you know, there is a feedback form that pops open when the webinar closes down. Please take the time to fill it in. I know that the presenters would be more than happy to have any feedback from today, as would CPA Australia as well. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.